So when it comes to protecting the data on drones, you two are the foremost experts in how the government is really handling that. So from a broad perspective, I would love to hear what is on your mind when it comes to protecting the data and protecting the ways that the government and first responders are using UAVs.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. So for the FAA, when we're looking at traditional aircraft certification, we're thinking about securing the systems on the aircraft from exploitation to ensure safety of flight. UAS, or unmanned aircraft systems, bring a whole different dynamic to that because it's not only thinking about securing the communication link to ensure that the UAS is operating safely, then you have the whole element of the data it's collecting. And while UAS are aircraft, they're also essentially flying computers and mobile phones and tablets, and in terms of their capability to capture, to store, and to transmit data. And so what people who are operating UAS for commercial or government purposes or are contracting those services need to think about it in the same way that they think about protecting their other data systems. So where is my information being stored? How is it being captured? How is it being transmitted? And what is the security of those links for doing that? And people really need to read their user terms of agreement for their UAS, because some of those terms of agreement, you essentially can't operate the UAS unless you enable that manufacturer to basically share, capture, and transmit and store your data anywhere they like to. And that's a very different dynamic than what we're used to dealing with. And so, especially when we see these being used for critical infrastructure inspection, dams, pipelines, railways, that's sensitive facility information associated with the nation's critical infrastructure. And so the protection of that information is extremely important. So it's really incumbent upon the operators to think about that, to really understand where that data is being shared, how it's being handled, and under what conditions, so they can make an informed decision about whether that's the platform that they want to use or whether there are additional protections that they need to put in place on their own in how they operate and take care of that data.
Herbie, I'm wondering, with the work that you do, have you reached out to vendors, the UAV vendors, and kind of talked about how they are thinking about these things? How are they looking to protect the data that these devices are collecting?
Yes, we have. We've done that in concert with Department of Defense, because all the counter UAS work we've been doing has been in concert with them. And that's tied into this too. This whole cybersecurity thing, yes, we're concerned about data and where it is, where it's going, who's looking at it. You know, from a law enforcement or first responder perspective, let's say, you know, law enforcement's all about, you know, winning a court case eventually at some point. So they have to treat that information that they get off a UAV like they would treat, you know, the information they get in a normal investigation, or from body cams or, you know, dashboard cams from police vehicles and stuff. And they don't share that with everybody, obviously, so they don't want the same thing that they would be getting off of a UAV being shared widely with people not involved in the investigation. On the other hand, you have like the firefighters who want to use it, and they really don't care if anyone else is watching them put out a fire. They just want to use it to help them get the fire put out and save lives. So it's kind of a dichotomy as to who's interested in what cybersecurity-wise in the first responder world. From a DHS world, where we are mostly in the law enforcement regime with some of our entities like CBP and stuff like that, we are also concerned with not only, we don't want other people to look at the information, we don't want them to see where we're flying it, that kind of stuff. We're also concerned about security of control links. So we've been doing testing about how secure they are, how easy it is to jam them, stuff like that. And I know one vendor's got a $100,000 drone sitting in a desert where we can't go pick it up right now because we successfully jammed their control link. Can we expand upon that at all? No, they volunteered with 5 other vendors to bring their systems to testing at their expense, basically. And so they're not real happy that their drone's sitting out there right now. But we're interested in that. And we're trying to figure out, you know, how do you protect the information? How do you protect the drone from being taken over? But on the counter side, of course, we want to be able to stop
Right.
those drones.
So let's expand upon something that you were talking about, the end users, the first responders.
Right.
What are you hearing as far as conversations on how they're thinking about this stuff? Because I imagine it's in its infancy. So when you're talking to either CBP or somebody on a state or local level, how's that conversation growing around, okay, you might be using this as a device, but you also need to worry about it from a cybersecurity standpoint?
Well, what I'm seeing, most of them are saying that they're going to treat all the information as the same as chain of custody rules and everything else. They have to set up the data structures, that kind of stuff. But they also have the issues of privacy. So they have to deal with the fact that, is there, personally identifiable information in this video? And if so, how long can we keep it? I think the new regulation helps provide some guidelines along that route to say that you can only store this information if PII is in there for up to 180 days or something like that, unless it's being used for, litigation court case. Then it can be kept longer than that. But as soon as that's done, you really got to get rid of it. So they really want to use the information. They're concerned that the UAVs that tend to not have the, as she has said, the user agreements that allow the manufacturer to basically download all the information off your drone every time you start it up and connect it to get an update to its operating system or something like that. They're concerned about that, and how do we keep that from happening? And most of the drones that don't enable that kind of function are more expensive than what your average first responder organization is interested in spending, because they're not rich. I mean, yeah, you do have some big guys like New York and San Francisco and the big cities who can afford basically a DoD kind of drone, but the local Mayberry RFD guy, can't afford that. He's buying the $1,000 drone system or the $2,000 drone system, and that's all he's going to be able to afford.
Angela, you hit upon it a little bit earlier, but talk to me about how you're seeing vendors, and not just vendors, but also public and private enterprises deal with the privacy implications of this data, because you have things like GDPR. You're going to see a California Privacy Act go online in 2020, and you're going to see other states also enact their own privacy laws. So how is the entire ecosystem sort of getting their arms around how privacy is changing when it comes to what these devices are collecting?
So I'm glad you asked that. Again, UAS are aircraft, but they're also this device that has data associated with it. It's capturing, collecting, and storing. And so we're in two different worlds, so to speak, that we're bringing together as we're looking at integrating UAS. Right now, from the FAA perspective, focused really on the safety piece and integration and supporting our security partners. We've really looked at privacy as something that's more of a whole of government activity, but realizing that they're flying now and that there are a lot of state and localities that are looking to put some regulatory structure in place to try to protect citizens and mimic some of the privacy laws that are in place for other types of ground-based activities. So it's a really interesting time, and it's one of the reasons why we have our UAS integrated pilot program that we're working on, which is the Secretary has selected 10 states, localities, tribal entities who have agreed to partner with us to conduct operations, and they're partnering with private UAS operators in some cases to look at what it's really like to operate these things in the airspace. What is it like to do the coordination with law enforcement? How do citizens feel about seeing UAS in and around their communities? And so this is really an opportunity, I think, to think about and really get some practical experience around what are the true challenges, what are the perceptions, what are the actual operational implications of these types of operations. And we're doing everything from facility inspection and critical infrastructure to moving AEDs to baiting traps for feral hogs. I mean, it's literally kind of across the full gamut, but it's just that because we are dealing truly with an aviation asset that is unlike anything else. And so I think that is going to start to inform not only the federal government's perspective on where is that line between what we handle at the federal level and what's appropriate at the state and local level, but also really get some practical applications. So as we look at rulemaking and regulatory activities or statutes and law, we really have a good basis and some data for making an assessment about where is that appropriate level of authority between the various parts of government and private citizen.
So we talk about these devices and the data they collect and how they are becoming part of the mission or the business line. But we were talking last week about this, and I'm interested to hear more, that you're also thinking about drones from a standpoint of them actually being a cybersecurity threat. So let's talk about that a little bit. How can these UAVs be a cybersecurity threat, and how are you looking to make sure that they're not too big of a threat?
Well, we look at the fact that a drone, it's a truck. It carries something that actually performs the mission you want, and you can change that to be almost what you want. In this case, you could put sensors on there that could actually sample the electromagnetic spectrum, other than cameras, obviously. You know, you could go listen to radio communications. You could potentially go in and pick up Wi-Fi signals, from buildings and try and get the information from their networks and stuff like that. That is a really difficult thing because, drones are hard to find already, small drones. You don't need a really big system if you take that drone and you fly it and you actually park it on the roof of a building. You don't need a big antenna system and everything. You maybe need an extra battery, but once it's not flying, it's not using a lot of power. It can just sit there or perch, as we say. And how do you find it? That's difficult, really, really difficult. We're looking at counter-UAS systems to try and help us find them, obviously, but there's been some issues with that in the past. The new legislation has given us more authority to look in the areas where we weren't allowed to look before.
I think it also forces the security regime. We're used to thinking ground-based security, and traditionally assets that we've protected through multiple layers of security, through isolating them, you have that now, you have to think in the third dimension. And before, where you would have to have an insider or you'd have to get through multiple layers of security to breach or get access to a system, now with relative anonymity, relative low cost, and a standoff capability, I can do that, with much greater ease and at a much lower risk. So it really opens up the opportunities for those types of activities that in the past may have taken some type of nation state or very well-sourced and funded capability to be able to access that. That now has come down and is a much lower risk and a much less costly endeavor to attempt. And so now we have to think about not just trying to isolate systems from an access perspective, but really we have to think about that in the third dimension of air as well.
So in the last minute that we have here, I will let you tell us what is your primary goal over the next 12 months in terms of really thinking about this in terms of both security and privacy, so both the public and private sector can use these things without the worry of what we just talked about?
Well, I would say from our perspective in DHS S&T, we have been working closely with the FAA and law enforcement to make sure that they are looking at their laws and their regulations for data, and that they are making the right changes to those to ensure that data they would get from UAVs, if they're using them, is protected to the extent it needs to be protected for their needs and for the private citizen. So that's ongoing, hasn't stopped, and I don't see that stopping forever, kind of thing. On the hardware side of the house, we're concerned with, can we exploit things that we need to exploit, but not let other people exploit the things that we want to do. So we're working hard on that.
Yeah, similarly, there is that tension between wanting to close up cybersecurity vulnerabilities while also ensuring that the current technology we have to exploit those when used by bad guys we're not offsetting that capability either. So it is a tension and something that we're weighing out. But also as first responders, law enforcement, other government and private sector entities are choosing to use UAS, and the capabilities and the ability to remove people from having to do unsafe activities through the use of UAS are virtually limitless. It's making sure they're making informed choices. What is the type of mission that I'm conducting, and and what do I need to be thinking about in terms of ensuring that the UAS I'm using has the commensurate protections for that mission. Like you said, if a firefighter doesn't care if, you know, the imagery of a fire goes somewhere else, obviously, when we're mapping pipelines, that might be a different story. So I think it's having that informed discussion that as, whether it's private sector or government, are building these programs, that they're thinking about that aspect of it when they're choosing the platform that they want to use.
Great. Angela, Herbie, really, really interesting conversation. Thanks for sharing some insights with us today.